On the morning of March 12, 1978, a 32-year-old widow named Nora Halsey drove a 4-row planter onto an 80-acre block of red Dawson County clay and planted 420 pounds of open-pollinated black amber sorghum seed that had been sitting in a sealed glass jar on a kitchen shelf since 1937. The seed was 44 years old. Her grandmother had bred it. Her mother had kept it. And every serious farmer between La Mesa and Lubbock agreed on exactly one thing. Nora Halsey had finally lost her mind. The jar itself was nothing remarkable to look at. It was a half-gallon mason jar with a zinc lid that had been sealed with a ring of paraffin wax applied by hand in February of 1937 by a woman named Vera Halsey, who had been 38 years old at the time and who had spent the previous 9 years at the Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College Experiment Station outside Lubbock, doing the most rigorous open-pollinated dryland sorghum breeding the southern Great Plains had ever produced. The paraffin had yellowed over the decades. The label on the glass, written in Vera's precise block hand with a grease pencil, had faded to the point where you had to hold the jar at an angle to the kitchen window light to read what it said. It said, Black Amber, 1934 Foundation, V. Halsey. Do not open except for refreshment. Nora had not opened it except for refreshment. Neither had her mother, Clara, before her. The jar had sat on the second shelf of the kitchen pantry in the Halsey home place outside La Mesa for 41 years, through drought years and wet years, and the Korean War, and the death of Nora's grandfather, and the death of Nora's father, and the death of Nora's husband, Roy, in an October field in 1973, when his Massey Ferguson swather threw a header bearing, and the arm came down. The jar had outlasted all of them. The paraffin had held. The seed inside had continued in the darkness of the pantry shelf to be what it was. Nora had known about the jar her entire life. She had known about it the way farm children know about the things that occupy permanent positions in the household, the way a child knows which drawer holds the spare flashlight, batteries in which cabinet holds the good china that comes out twice a year. The jar was on the shelf. The jar had always been on the shelf. The jar would be on the shelf when Nora was grown and farming and old. What she had not known, not fully not, in the way that knowledge becomes the thing you act on rather than the thing you carry around, was what the jar meant. She found out in the winter of 1977. Clara Halsey had died in December of 1976 at the kitchen table of the same farmhouse where the jar sat on the shelf of a heart attack that happened between the first and second cup of coffee on a Tuesday morning. She had been 57 years old. She had been, in the opinion of everyone who farmed dryland ground in Dawson County, one of the finest practical agronomists the Texas Panhandle had produced in the 20th century. A judgment that was rarely stated aloud, because Clara Halsey was a woman, and the men at the La Mesa Cafe did not, as a general rule, describe women in those terms, but they knew it. The way you know something you have decided not to say. Clara had left Nora, the home place, the pantry jar, a leather-bound breeding notebook that Vera had started in March of 1928, and that Clara had continued in her own hand from 1962 until the autumn before she died. And a letter. The letter was in a plain white envelope in the top drawer of the bedroom dresser, addressed in Clara's handwriting to Nora specifically, not to the estate, not to the family, to Nora. It had been there since 1971. Clara had put it there 5 years before she died, because Clara Halsey was the kind of woman who prepared for things. Nora had read the letter twice in the week after Clara's funeral, and then put it in the dresser herself and not read it again until the winter of 1977, when she sat down with the breeding notebook and the jar and Clara's 5-year refreshment records and decided that she was going to make a decision about the seed before the spring planting window opened. The letter was 3 pages written in pencil, in the careful cursive Clara used for correspondence that mattered. It began with practical instructions about the refreshment cycle and the storage protocol and the seed selection criteria that Vera had documented in the notebook. It described the planting density and the row spacing and the reason for north-south orientation along the prevailing wind axis. These were the things Clara had done for 30 years and had written down so they would not die with her. The 3rd page was different. On the 3rd page, Clara had copied word for word the last entry in Vera Halsey's section of the breeding notebook, written in December of 1936, 3 months before Vera left the Lubbock station with the jar in a cardboard box and a handshake from Dr. Edna Renfro, who would herself be let go 6 months later, when the Texas A&M Sorghum Improvement Program reorganized around hybrid breeding and decided that open pollinated lines were a problem belonging to the past. Vera had written, "The program has chosen the hybrid path. I understand the yield argument. The yield argument is correct for good years. I have spent 9 years selecting this line specifically for the years that are not good, for hail, for the wind off the Llano Estacado, for the kind of drought that comes in May and does not leave until August. The hybrid will out-yield us in the easy years. In the hard years, it will fail. When the hard year comes, and it will come in a season nobody is predicting. The line will still be standing. Someone needs to keep it until that season arrives. I am trusting that someone to be Clara. I am trusting Clara to find the next someone after her." Below that, in Clara's hand, was one additional line that had not come from the notebook. Clara had written it herself in the winter of 1971 when she had sealed the envelope and put it in the dresser. It said, "Nora, you are the next someone." Nora had sat with those pages for a long time in the January cold of the farmhouse kitchen. The jar was on the table in front of her because she had taken it from the pantry shelf for the first time in 6 years to look at it while she read. The label was faded. The paraffin was old. The glass was cloudy in the way that glass gets cloudy when it has been in one place for a very long time. She had set the letter down. She had picked up the jar. She had held it the way you hold something that is heavier than its physical weight, which is carefully and with both hands, understanding that the weight is not in the object itself, but in what the object represents, and that if you drop it, the thing you lose is not replaceable. Vera Halsey had been dead for 15 years. Clara Halsey had been dead for a year. Roy Halsey had been dead for 4 years. The 80-acre home place block was Nora's to plant or not plant as she chose, and every choice had consequences. And the only guidance she had came from a leather notebook written between 1928 and 1976 by 2 women who had each spent their lives learning things that the agricultural establishment of the Texas Panhandle had decided it did not need to know. She had put the jar back on the shelf that January evening. She had taken the notebook to the kitchen table and read it from the first page to the last, all of it the entire 48 years of Vera's and Clara's combined record. She read the germination tables and the selection criteria, and the yield comparisons and the stem caliper measurements, and the drought response observations, and the hail damage assessments from 1929 and from 1932 and from 1947. She read Vera's notes on Mediterranean dryland tolerance and African stem strength, and the 6 consecutive growing seasons of Castro County clay selection that had produced the 1934 line. She read Clara's 30 years of refreshment records. The careful documentation of every 5-year cycle, the seed weights, and the germination rates and the selection criteria applied each time to maintain the line's characteristics without narrowing its genetic base. She read until 2 in the morning. Then she put the notebook down and looked at the jar on the shelf for a while. In January of 1978, she went to the county extension office in La Mesa and asked if they had any documentation on the viability of open-pollinated sorghum seed stored in sealed glass at ambient temperature for 40 or more years. The extension office did not have documentation on this specific question. The extension agent on duty, a man named Carl Briggs, who had been at the office for 3 years and who was 29 years old, suggested she contact the Texas A&M Sorghum Improvement Program in College Station, which she did. She also conducted her own viability test. She had a wooden seed counting tray that her grandfather Cleon Halsey had carved in 1951 from a single block of mesquite with 100 shallow counter-sunk wells in a 10 by 10 grid, each well sized to hold 1 sorghum seed. She laid 200 seeds from the working planting stock on damp paper towels and set the tray on the kitchen windowsill and checked it every morning at 6 and every evening at 6 and recorded the germination count in pencil in the back pages of the breeding notebook. She moistened the paper towels twice a day. She waited. On the 19th day, she counted the final sprouts. 182 of the 200 seeds had germinated. That was a 91% germination rate on seed that had been in storage for 44 years. She wrote the number down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote beside it in parentheses for comparison Clara's 1976 fresh harvest test, 93%. The seed had not declined. 44 years on a pantry shelf in a sealed glass jar with a paraffin ring had preserved the line in a condition essentially identical to fresh harvest. She did not know at the time that this was remarkable by any scientific standard. She knew it because she had tested it herself with a mesquite tray and damp paper towels on a kitchen windowsill in January. 3 weeks after she wrote to College Station, the answer came back. The Texas A&M Sorghum Improvement Program had no record under the name Black Amber, nor under any variant of the Halsey designation. The letter noted that all heritage open-pollinated sorghum lines from the pre-1937 era had been deaccessioned from the program's seed bank in 1953 due to storage constraints and institutional reorganization. Nora read the letter at the kitchen table. She read the relevant sentence twice. She set the letter down. She looked at the jar on the shelf. The Texas A&M Sorghum Improvement Program had thrown away what Vera Halsey had spent 9 years making. They had thrown it away in 1953 because they needed the shelf space. What was left, what was the only thing left, was in a mason jar with a faded label and a yellowed paraffin ring on a pantry shelf in a farmhouse outside La Mesa, Texas. She had folded the letter carefully and put it in the back cover of the breeding notebook. Then she had gone out to the equipment shed and calibrated the 4-row planter for the black amber seed, which had a slightly larger kernel than the modern hybrid varieties, and required the seed plates to be hand-modified with a small file and a caliper to plant at the correct density without cracking the grain. She used the caliper her grandfather Cleon had bought at the La Mesa hardware store in 1948. She worked by the light of the shop light for 2 evenings until the plates were right. Then she checked the row spacing and the planting depth and ran the planter empty across the shop floor to verify the seed drop rate. On the morning of March 12th, she drove it out onto the 80-acre block. By the second week of April 1978, every farmer within 40 miles of La Mesa had heard about the Halsey widow's heritage planting. The La Mesa Cafe sat on the main block of the county seat, and on Tuesday and Friday mornings the long counter filled with men in tall-crowned stockman's hats, drinking coffee and arguing about the matters that occupied the professional attention of dryland sorghum farmers in Dawson County in the spring of 1978, which included the price of anhydrous ammonia, the prospects for the winter wheat carry, and the question of whether the new Pioneer 8444 hybrid, released the previous autumn, was going to outperform the DeKalb DK52 on the heavier clay soils in the east part of the county. Nora Halsey's 80-acre planting had, by the second Tuesday of April, become the dominant topic at the counter. Not because anyone thought it would work, because of the particular quality of entertainment that a confident prediction of failure provides to people who are secure in their own correctness. Gordon Tate had been the Dawson County Extension agent for 19 years. He was 61 years old, and he wore the A&M field polo tucked into his Wrangler jeans, and he drove a white county pickup that was always clean because he washed it himself every Saturday morning, which was a habit he had maintained for 19 years, because he believed that the county vehicle represented the county's investment in agricultural education and should look like it. He was not a cruel man. He was not a malicious man. He was a man who had spent 19 years being correct about things in public, which had given him a particular confidence in his own correctness that had become indistinguishable from his personality. Gordon said at the April Dawson County Sorghum Producers Association meeting, standing at the front of the room in the county agricultural building with 60 farmers in folding chairs in front of him, that the Halsey operation was doing something that he respected as a personal gesture toward agricultural heritage, but that nobody in the room should mistake for a production decision. He said that the yield gap between Bones Black Amber Open Pollinated and the current Pioneer or DeKalb hybrid lines on Dawson County dryland was in the range of 35 to 40% in normal rainfall years. He said that at the autumn cash price of $4.10 per hundredweight, that yield gap on 80 acres represented a revenue difference of approximately $12,000 annually. He said that grief expressed itself in different ways, and that the agricultural community should be supportive of a widow who was working through a difficult period in the only way she knew how. He said this with the genuine sympathy of a man who believed every word of it. There was some laughter. Not the mean kind exactly, the kind that comes when a room full of people share a conclusion and find small comfort in sharing it together. Gordon said it again at the La Mesa Cafe counter on 2 consecutive Friday mornings. He said it in a lower voice at the counter of the Dawson County Farm Bureau office. He said a version of it to the loan officer at First National Bank of La Mesa, who had already said a version of it to Nora herself in April, pulling her aside after a routine deposit to ask in a careful, respectful voice whether she had considered the implications of a 35% yield reduction on her household budget across a multi-year horizon. Nora had looked at the loan officer, whose name was Gerald Pruitt, and who had been at that bank for 11 years, and who was genuinely trying to be helpful, and she had said that she had considered the implications carefully, and that her budget analysis indicated the operation was financially viable at projected heritage yields. Gerald Pruitt had nodded and said he was glad to hear it, and that the bank was always available if she needed to discuss options. She had thanked him and driven home. The mockery at the La Mesa Cafe was not in its majority cruel. It had the quality of small-town disbelief wearing the clothes of concern, which is a particular form of condescension that does not recognize itself as condescension, because it is genuinely felt. The men at the counter were not wrong about the yield numbers. The Pioneer 8444 would out-yield black amber by 35 to 40% in a normal year. That was a verifiable agricultural fact, and Gordon Tate had stated it accurately. What the men at the counter were not considering, what it did not occur to them to consider, was that the yield number was not the only number that mattered. A man named Asa Goodnight, who had been farming dryland in Dawson County since 1948, and who had set Cleon Halsey's first windmill the same year, said at the counter on the third Friday of April that he reckoned the Halsey widow had let her grief get ahead of her judgment. He said it with the particular authority of a man who had known Cleon and who felt that this gave him a certain standing in the assessment of Halsey family decisions. He said it without malice. He said it because he believed it. The minister's wife at First Baptist said something similar at the church potluck on the third Sunday of April, pulling Nora aside in the fellowship hall basement next to a folding table with a casserole on it, and asking in a careful voice whether Roy would have approved. Nora looked at her across the corner of the folding table. She said Roy would have asked her what her mother thought about it. The minister's wife said nothing. Nora carried her pinto bean casserole to the kitchen and washed her own dish. Dale Braddock heard about the planning from his hired man, a lean, quiet Texan named Holt Greer, who had been working the Braddock operation for 12 years and who had driven past the Halsey home place on a Sunday morning in early April and seen Nora finishing the third day's rows on the 80-acre block from the open station John Deere 402 she had inherited from Roy. Holt had told Dale at the equipment shed on a Monday morning. Dale had not believed him. Dale had driven past the home place himself on the Tuesday afternoon and counted by the rough estimate of a man who had run a planter for 36 years, somewhere between 70 and 90 acres of freshly planted ground in straight north-south rows. Dale Braddock was 58 years old in the spring of 1978. He farmed 1,200 acres of irrigated hybrid grain sorghum and dryland wheat on the section bordering the Halsey home place to the south and west. He was tall and weather-worn, and he had the deep-set eyes of a man who had spent his entire adult life looking across flat plains in strong light. He had wanted the Halsey home place before Roy died. He had wanted it more after. He had not, in the 4.5 years between Roy's death and the heritage planting, raised the subject with Nora directly. He had approached it the way careful men approach things they want and cannot simply take, which is sideways and with patience. He had stopped by on Sunday afternoons. He had sent his wife Imogene over with food in the weeks after Roy's funeral. He had offered to disc Nora's stubble in the fall of 1974, and again in 1975. He had offered to send Holt over to service the windmill on the north end of the home place. He had told her more than once in the tone of a concerned neighbor that any decision she wanted to make about the operation would have his full support. Nora had thanked him. She had not leased the 80-acre block. She had not asked Holt to service the windmill. She had serviced the windmill herself with a wrench set and a can of lubricant and a borrowed ladder from the implement co-op. The heritage planting changed the nature of what Dale had been calculating. He drove home to Imogene on the Tuesday afternoon after he counted the rows, and he sat at the kitchen table with his hat on the table and his elbows on the oilcloth. And he said, "Imogene, my brother's widow, has gone and planted that old heritage line on the whole home place block." Imogene Braddock had been married to Dale for 32 years, and she had a clear and accurate understanding of the difference between concern for a neighbor and interest in a neighbor's land. She set down the coffee pot. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Dale Roy Halsey was your brother, and Nora Halsey is your sister-in-law, and she is 32 years old, and she has buried a husband and a mother and a father in 5 years. She said you will go over there tomorrow morning and you will ask her what she has planted and why she has planted it, and you will listen to the whole answer before you say one word. Dale had gone over the next morning. Nora was on her knees at the south end of the 80-acre block, checking a row with a hand trowel, when she heard Dale's truck pull up to the gate. She did not turn around. She finished the row she was checking. She stood. She walked across the freshly planted ground to the gate. She said, "Dale, you want coffee?" He said no. She crossed her arms and waited. He said, "Holt told me last week. I drove past myself Tuesday afternoon. I counted somewhere upwards of 80 acres of planted ground. I came home and I told Imogene. Imogene told me to come over here and ask you what in God's name you have done. She said I planted the 1934 black amber line my grandmother bred at the A&M station outside Lubbock. The seed my mother kept on a shelf for 41 years. I planted it at 42,000 seeds per acre on north-south rows along the prevailing wind axis. He said, Nora, you planted a 44-year-old open-pollinated line on 80 acres of dry land in 1978. The Pioneer 8444 will outyield your line by 35 to 40%. At the autumn cash price, your yield gap is $11,000 to $12,000. You are going to lose $12,000 honoring your dead mother with a seed that has not been grown commercially since before the war. She said I can replant in May if that is what you were about to offer. The hybrid seed is on the shelf at the La Mesa Co-op. I can till the heritage under and replant on the same 80 in 2 weeks. He paused. He said yes. He said he would pay for the replant seed. He said he would take the dissing off her hands. He said she could owe him until November with no interest. He said he was not asking for anything in return. She looked at him for a moment. She said, Dale, my grandmother wrote in her notebook in December of 1936 that the hybrid will outyield the heritage line in the good years. She wrote that in the bad years, the hybrid will fail, and the heritage will still be standing. She wrote that someone needed to keep the line until the bad year came. He said, Nora, you cannot farm for one bad year in a decade. She said, I am not farming for one bad year. I am farming the line every year because it is the right line for this ground. My grandmother selected it for this ground specifically for the clay and the wind and the hail that comes off the Llano Estacado in May. The yield gap is real, and I have accounted for it in my budget. The line at 4,200 weight per acre at current cash prices pays the property taxes, the seed bill, the fertilizer, the diesel, and clears a small profit. The bad year when it comes is the bonus. I am not asking you to understand this. I am telling you what I am doing. Dale stood at the gate for a long moment. He looked past Nora at the 80-acre block of freshly planted ground in its straight north-south rows. He looked back at her. He said, Nora, I cannot help you, and I cannot stop you. He put his hat back on. He said, I will watch what happens. He drove home. When he got home, Imogene was in the kitchen. He sat down at the table. She said, well. He said, she is not replanting. Imogene said, what did she say? He told her what Nora had said about the notebook and the bad year and the yield gap analysis. Imogene listened to all of it. Then she said, Dale Braddock, that woman just told you. She has done the math, and she has read her grandmother's work, and she has made a decision she can stand behind. She said you drove over there to talk her out of it. She said what you should have done was drive over there to hear it. Dale said nothing. Imogene said, I will tell you something else. She said that jar has been on that family shelf since 1937. And that line has been grown and refreshed and documented in that notebook since 1928. And Vera Halsey spent 9 years of her life making it. And Clara Halsey spent 30 years keeping it. And Nora Halsey has read every page of what they left her. She said the least you can do is wait and see before you decide she is wrong. Dale drove past the Halsey home place every autumn from 1978 forward. He drove past in October when the standing grain was at its peak height before the harvest. He slowed the truck at the east fence line and counted the yield by the rough visual estimate of a man who had run a combine for 36 years. He never stopped. He never got out. He never told Holt or Imogene or anyone at the La Mesa Cafe what he saw when he drove past. He drove on and said nothing and let Gordon Tate and Asa Goodnight and the men at the counter say what they said. The 1978 harvest came in October. Nora ran the John Deere 402 with a combine header she had borrowed from the implement co-op and harvested the 80-acre block over 3 days in mid-October, when the grain was at the right moisture for cutting. The yield came in at 4,300 weight per acre on the drier west end of the block and 4,500 on the east end where the clay held moisture longer. The grain test weight was 61 pounds per bushel against a Dawson County hybrid average that year of 58. The protein content was 12.4% against a hybrid average of 9.6. She sold the entire harvest to the Hereford Grain Cooperative at $4.10 per hundredweight. Total revenue was $51,000 on an 80-acre block. After fuel and seed saved from the previous year's selection plot and fertilizer at the low rate the heritage line required, in the property tax allocation, the net was $19,400. The Braddock operation in the same season on 1,200 acres of Pioneer 8444 netted $78,000. On a per-acre basis, the Braddock operation netted $65 per acre. On a per-acre basis, the Halsey operation netted $242 per acre. Nora did not publish these numbers. She did not bring them to the La Mesa Cafe. She did not send them to Gordon Tate. She wrote them in the back pages of the breeding notebook in the same pencil she used for everything else in the same careful columns her grandmother and mother had used. And she went back to work. Gordon Tate did not, in the autumn of 1978, revise his public assessment of the heritage planting. He attributed the per-acre net difference to lower input costs on a smaller block and said that one good season proved nothing about a multi-year production strategy. He said this at the November sorghum producers meeting. He said it at the La Mesa Cafe. He said it without any awareness that he might be wrong, because he was a man who had spent 19 years being correct about things in public, and the habit of that had made it difficult for him to hear the early sound of his own incorrectness. Asa Goodnight did not revise his assessment either. He said at the counter in November that Nora had gotten lucky on input costs and that the real test would come in a bad weather year. He was right about that last part. The years after 1978 were the years of deep work, not dramatic work. Not the kind of work that gets noticed or discussed. The kind of work that happens in the early mornings before anyone is watching and in the evenings after. The field work is done the kind that accumulates across seasons, the way the selection cycles in the breeding notebook had accumulated across decades, one careful entry at a time. Nora harvested the 80-acre block every October. She ran the 5-year refreshment cycle on a 5-acre selection plot on the north end of the home place, exactly as Clara and Vera had done before her. She kept the breeding records in the leather notebook. She added her own observations in the back pages in the same pencil columns: soil temperature at planting, row emergence timing, stem caliper measurements at 30 days and at 60, leaf width, boot development, Grain fill timing. Hail damage assessment after the minor storm of June 1979 that had crossed the north end of the county and left dents in the grain truck hood without doing significant field damage. The minor storm of June 1979 had taken 12% off the county hybrid average and 3% off the Halsey block. She wrote that down too. She did not tell anyone. By 1980, the men at the La Mesa Cafe had stopped making the direct jokes about the heritage planting. Not because they had changed their minds, because Nora Halsey came to the La Mesa Cafe occasionally, and it had become uncomfortable to make the jokes in front of her. The mockery moved to the spaces she did not occupy. It became more specific. Focused now on the peculiarity of one woman farming 80 acres of pre-war sorghum genetics on the same ground. Her grandmother had selected them for the stubborn eccentricity of it. The refusal to modernize that the men at the counter had decided was the defining characteristic of the operation. The per-acre net numbers for 1979, 1980, and 1981 continued to run at 2 to 3 times the per-acre net of the hybrid operations in the county. Nobody at the counter discussed this. The numbers existed in the breeding notebook in the Halsey farmhouse kitchen, and nowhere else. In January of 1982, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the breeding notebook and a cup of coffee and wrote a letter. She had been reading over the previous 2 years the handful of academic journal articles that touched on heritage sorghum genetics. She subscribed to Crop Science and to the Texas Agricultural Experiment Station Bulletin. And she had read in the 1981 issue of Crop Science a paper by an associate professor at Texas A&M named Dr. Francis Whitmore, whose research program focused on heritage line genetic resources in dryland cereal crops. The paper was titled Recovering Pre-Hybrid Sorghum Genetics from Operator-Maintained Heritage Plots. Nora had read it twice. She had bought a reprint from the journal for $1.25. She wrote Dr. Whitmore a letter on a sheet of lined notebook paper in pencil. She described the black amber line. She described Vera's 9 years at the Lubbock station. She described Clara's 42-year refreshment cycle. She described the 1978 planting and the 4 years of yield and quality records. She described the germination viability test she had run in January of 1978 with her grandfather's mesquite counting tray. She mailed it on a Tuesday morning. She drove to town and dropped it in the box outside the post office and drove home and did not think about it again because she had work to do and the spring planting window was 2 months away. Dr. Francis Whitmore answered 3 weeks later. She said yes. She said she could come in the spring of 1982. She said she would need 4 days minimum. She said the germination data Nora had described was, if accurate, among the most remarkable long-term sorghum storage results in the literature outside of controlled atmosphere gene banks. She arrived at the Halsey Gate on the morning of April 14, 1982, in a maroon Plymouth with 2 graduate student assistants in the back seat. She was 44 years old, and she wore a canvas field jacket and carried a yellow legal pad and measuring instruments in a canvas bag. And she introduced herself to Nora at the gate in the way of a scientist who had learned that the most important thing you could do on the first day of a farm visit was say as little as possible and look at as much as possible. She asked to walk the 80-acre block on foot before they did anything else. Nora walked her out. The April light was long and copper across the emerging seedlings. Dr. Whitmore stopped at the 3rd row. She crouched down. She took a small ruler from her canvas bag and measured a seedling. She looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then she took a caliper from the bag and measured the stem diameter at the soil line. She looked at the reading. She wrote it on the yellow legal pad. She stood up and looked at Nora. She said, "Mrs. Halsey, the seedling vigor on this stand is 40% above the Pioneer 8444 reference plot at College Station. The coloptile emergence is uniform across the full block. The stem caliper at the soil line is 23% above the hybrid reference." She paused. She said, "I have not seen anything like this in 12 years of dryland sorghum research. I am here for 4 days. May I have 6? Nora gave her 6. Dr. Whitmore walked the block, sampled the seed bins, photographed the pages of the breeding notebook, and recorded the complete breeding history from Vera's first entry in March of 1928 through Nora's most recent observation the previous October. She returned to the kitchen on the 6th evening. She sat across the formica table from Nora with her yellow legal pads in a stack in front of her. She was quiet for a moment before she spoke. She said, "Mrs. Halsey, your grandmother's 1928 to 1934 selection cycle at the Lubbock Station was, by my professional assessment, the most rigorous open-pollinated dryland sorghum breeding program of the pre-hybrid era in the southern Great Plains. She said the line you are growing is genetically distinct from any modern hybrid. It carries gene complexes for stem strength, hail tolerance, drought escape, and heat shock recovery that the hybrid breeding programs eliminated in the 1940s in the process of selecting for maximum grain yield." She paused again. She looked at Nora directly. She said, "Your line is as far as I can determine from the current literature and from the Texas A&M program records. I have reviewed the only standing field expression of pre-hybrid Texas dryland sorghum genetics in the United States as of April 1982. Nora looked at her. She said the A&M program deaccessioned everything in 1953. Dr. Whitmore said yes. She said they threw away what you kept. She said, "I am going to publish this. I will not use your name. I will refer to your operation as Cooperator H in the literature. The agronomy community is going to spend the next 20 years trying to recover what your grandmother already had in 1934. Nora said, "Do not use my name." Dr. Whitmore said, "I will not use your name." She packed her instruments and her legal pads and her canvas bag and drove back to College Station in the maroon Plymouth with the 2 graduate student assistants and the photographs of the breeding notebook and 4 years of yield records and caliper measurements that confirmed what a woman in Dawson County, Texas, had known from reading her grandmother's handwriting by kitchen light. The line was real. The selection had been correct. The 44 years on the pantry shelf had not diminished it. The hard year was still coming. Vera Halsey had said so in 1936, and Clara Halsey had copied it in 1971, and Nora Halsey had read it in January of 1977 and planted it in March of 1978. All that remained was to wait for the season nobody was predicting. The winter of 1981 came into Dawson County the way bad winters come into the Texas Panhandle. Not with drama, but with a slow, relentless cold that settled into the clay and didn't leave. The autumn had been dry. The winter wheat had gone in thin and the stands were uneven. And by December, the county elevator manager was telling anyone who asked that he expected a difficult spring across the board. Nora had brought the 1981 harvest in at 3,800 weight per acre, down from her 7-year average of 4,200. The autumn had been dry, and the dry had shown in the grain fill, and she had known by August what October would look like. She had written 3,800 in the breeding notebook column and added a note about the soil moisture deficit at the 60-day mark and how the line had responded to it, which was by accelerating maturity and concentrating grain. fill into a shorter window a drought escape response that Vera had documented in 1929 and 1932, and that Nora was now seeing herself in real time on the same ground. The yield was down. The net was down. The checking account at First National Bank of La Mesa showed a balance in February of 1982 that was lower than it had been since the year after Roy died. Gerald Pruitt at the bank had not said anything yet. He was waiting. Nora understood that he was waiting, and she understood what he was waiting for, which was a second consecutive difficult year which would give him a professional and personal justification for the conversation he had been restraining himself from having since 1978. Gordon Tate wrote a short piece in the Dawson County Sorghum Producers Association winter newsletter. He did not name Nora. He referred to non-standard production methods and noted that heritage open-pollinated varieties showed particular vulnerability in moisture-deficit years due to their lower yield ceiling and reduced input response efficiency. He said that the current data from the Texas A&M Extension Service continued to support hybrid selection for dryland production in the Texas South Plains. He said this was especially relevant for smaller operations where financial resilience was limited. He did not name her. He did not need to. Every farmer in Dawson County who read the newsletter knew which operation he meant. There was only one non-standard production operation on Dawson County dryland in the winter of 1982. There had only ever been one. In late January, a man named Bill Cordell called the Halsey farmhouse. Bill Cordell worked for a Lubbock real estate firm that specialized in agricultural land transactions in the South Plains counties. He said he was reaching out to a select group of landowners in Dawson County who owned smaller acreage blocks with favorable soil profiles, because he had clients actively looking to expand their operational footprint in the county and wanted to make sure he was offering everyone a chance to participate in what he described as a favorable acquisition environment. Nora asked him who his clients were. He said he was not at liberty to say specifically, but that he could tell her the interest was from an established local operation with a strong financial position. She said, "Thank you for the call," and hung up. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment after she hung up. She knew who the established local operation was. She had known before she asked. She looked at the jar on the pantry shelf. The paraffin had gone the color of old bone. The label had faded further. The glass was cloudy at the bottom where the seed touched it. She went to the bedroom dresser and took out the white envelope with Clara's letter in it and sat down at the kitchen table. She read the third page again, the page with Vera's 1936 notebook entry copied in Clara's hand. She read the last line, "You are the next someone." She put the letter back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in the dresser. She went to the pantry and took down the jar and carried it to the kitchen table and set it in front of her. She sat with it for the long time. The checking account balance was what it was. The 1982 planting window was 11 weeks away. The seed in the jar was the only surviving stock of its genetics in the United States, and possibly in the world, because Dr. Whitmore had confirmed that the A&M program had nothing, and the National Gene Bank had nothing, and the literature contained no record of another operator-maintained black amber plot anywhere in the country. If she sold the land, she would need to sell the seed with it or store it somewhere else, and if she stored it somewhere else, she would no longer be running the refreshment cycle. And if she stopped running the refreshment cycle, the line would degrade over time, because that was what open-pollinated lines did without active selection pressure. They drifted the characteristics Vera had spent 9 years fixing into. The genetics slowly dissolved back into variability. If she sold the land, the line would survive for perhaps another generation, and then it would not. She sat with the jar in front of her and looked at it, and thought about Roy, and thought about Clara, and thought about Vera, walking out of the Lubbock station in February of 1937, with a cardboard box and a handshake and a jar of foundation seed that nobody else had wanted to keep. Then she picked up the phone and called Bill Cordell back. She said she was not interested in any acquisition conversations at the present time, or at any foreseeable future time, and that if the established local operation he represented wanted to have a direct conversation about land use in Dawson County, they were welcome to knock on her door themselves. Bill Cordell said he understood and thanked her for her time. Nora put the jar back on the pantry shelf. She went out to the equipment shed and checked the planter and the seed bins and the breeding notebook entries for the seed selection from the 1981 harvest, which she had completed in November. The selection was good. The line was clean. She had pulled the strongest stems from the best-yielding rows and shelled them by hand and run them through the hand-cleaned seed tray and stored the result in the labeled bins behind the milk house. The seed was ready. She planted in March. The 1982 harvest came in at 400 weight per acre, a recovery from 1981. That reflected a better moisture year across the board. Gordon Tate's newsletter piece was not referenced again in any public forum. The men at the La Mesa Cafe moved on to other topics. Dale Braddock drove past the home place in October, as he had driven past every October since 1978, and he counted the standing grain from the truck window without stopping. Dr. Frances Whitmore published the first of her papers on the Halsey line in the spring of 1983 in Crop Science under the designation Cooperator H. The paper described the germination viability results, the stem caliper measurements, and the preliminary genetic characterization of the black amber material. It was read by every sorghum geneticist at every land-grant university west of the Mississippi River. None of them found Cooperator H. Nora's name appeared nowhere in the paper, and the location of the cooperator was described only as a private dryland operation in the Texas South Plains. Dr. Whitmore published a second paper in 1984 in the Agronomy Journal that addressed the drought escape response Nora had been documenting since 1978. The accelerated maturity and concentrated grain fill under moisture deficit that Vera had first selected for in the drought years of 1929 and 1932. The paper described this response as genetically fixed, at a level not seen in any modern hybrid line, and suggested that the gene complexes responsible had been effectively eliminated from the commercial breeding pool during the yield maximization selection of the 1940s and 1950s. Nora read both papers at the kitchen table. She wrote Dr. Whitmore a one-page letter in response to each, noting her own field observations that corresponded to the published findings, and adding 3 years of additional data that had not been included in the initial research visit. Dr. Whitmore incorporated the additional data into her ongoing analysis. Their correspondence continued through 1984 and into 1985, one careful letter at a time, Nora writing in pencil on lined paper, and Dr. Whitmore responding on Texas A&M letterhead with her own handwritten annotations in the margins. The academic community that read Dr. Whitmore's papers understood that something significant had survived somewhere in the Texas South Plains. They did not know where. They did not know who. Nora had asked that it stay that way, and Dr. Whitmore had honored the request. The winter of 1984 into 1985 was the kind of winter that comes in the Texas Panhandle once every decade or so. A wet winter that put 3 inches of precipitation into the soil profile across the South Plains counties and set the stage for a green and growing spring. The hybrid sorghum stands came up thick in April and May of 1985. The Pioneer 8444 and the DeKalb DK52 and the new Northrop King NK265 that the seed dealers had been promoting heavily since the previous autumn. Gordon Tate drove the county roads in his clean white pickup and looked at the standing crops and wrote in his spring bulletin that conditions across Dawson County were as favorable as he had seen in his 26 years in the county extension office. He wrote that the 1985 season was shaping up to be among the strongest production years in recent memory. He wrote that on May 9, 1985. The morning of May 17th opened with high pressure across the Panhandle and a dew point in the low 50s, and a sky that was the particular shade of blue that the Panhandle gets in late spring, when the air is dry and the light is clean, and everything in the fields is at the early boot stage, with the grain heads just beginning to form inside the protective sheath of the upper leaf. It was a beautiful morning. It was the kind of morning that makes a farmer feel that the work of the previous year and the previous winter has been correctly done and that the season ahead will honor that work. By 2 in the afternoon, a dry line had pushed east out of eastern New Mexico into Bailey County, 1 county west of Dawson. The pressure gradient behind it was steep. The dew point on the east side of the dry line was in the mid-60s. Ahead of it, the air was still dry and blue and quiet. By 3 in the afternoon, the dry line had reached the western edge of Dawson County, and a line of supercell thunderstorms had begun to fire along its leading edge. The National Weather Service office in Lubbock issued a severe thunderstorm warning at 3:22 in the afternoon. The warning mentioned large hail. Nora heard the warning on the kitchen radio at 3:30. She went to the back porch and looked west. The cloud line was there maybe 40 miles out the anvil tops of the supercells, spreading east at altitude in the distinctive flat-top shape that means the storm has found its ceiling and is now building horizontally, pushing its energy outward in the direction of travel. She went back inside. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table with the breeding notebook open to the current year's observation pages. She did not go to the field. There was nothing she could do in the field. What was in the field was either going to hold or it was not going to hold, and her presence in the field would not change which of those things happened. She had known since she first read Vera's 1936 notebook entry that the question of whether the line would hold under hail was not a question she would answer with her own eyes in a normal growing season. It was a question that would be answered by the weather, on the weather's schedule in the weather's way. She had been waiting for this since 1978. She did not feel dramatic about it. She felt the way a person feels who has prepared for something for a long time and has now arrived at the moment when the preparation either was enough or was not. Calm and specific and very focused on the sound of the sky. The first hailstone hit the corrugated tin roof of the milk house at 4:14 in the afternoon. It was a single stone one impact, and then a 2-second silence, and then another. And then by 4:15 the roof of the milk house and the roof of the equipment shed and the roof of the chicken house and the hood of the grain truck were under a continuous barrage of hailstones that the National Weather Service in Lubbock would later record as golf ball size 1.75 inches in diameter on average, falling at an average rate of 340 stones per square yard per minute over a 14-minute peak intensity period. The kitchen window on the west side of the house blew in at 4:21. The glass came in with the wind and the hail, and Nora was already moving. She pulled the oilcloth tarp off the back porch hook and crossed the kitchen, and hand stapled it across the broken frame in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She had practiced this in her mind since the June 1979 storm. Not literally, not with an actual tarp, but in the way that a person who has spent their life on the plains practices the contingencies of the plains by thinking through them clearly enough that when they happen, the body already knows what to do. She did not look out at the 80-acre block while the hail was still falling. She went back to the kitchen table. She sat down. The coffee she had made at 3:45 had gone cold. She drank it anyway. The noise on the roofs was continuous and very loud, the sound of several hundred pounds of ice per minute hitting tin and wood and sheet metal. The particular roar of a serious hail event on a working farm that anyone who has heard it once does not forget. She thought about Vera standing at the Lubbock station in the spring of 1929, watching the first hail event she had documented measuring the stem damage on the early selection plots. The morning after writing in the notebook that the Mediterranean lines showed 68% stem breakage, and the native African crosses showed 31%, and the combination lines she had been developing for 3 years showed 14%. She thought about Vera understanding in that spring of 1929 that she had found something worth keeping, and spending the next 5 years fixing it into a stable line that she named for her infant daughter. She thought about Clara running the 1947 refreshment cycle in the summer that a hailstorm had crossed the north end of the home place in June and left the 5-acre selection plot bruised but standing while the hybrid plots on the neighboring sections were on the ground. She thought about whether the 1985 storm was the season nobody had predicted. The barrage on the roof slowed at 4:28 and stopped at 4:33. The silence that followed it was the particular silence of after when the storm is past and the damage is finished, and the question of how much has shifted from speculation to fact. Nora sat at the kitchen table for 7 minutes after the last stone hit the roof. Then she put on her boots and her canvas jacket and walked out the back door. The hailstones were still on the ground, some of them whole, most of them fractured by impact, lying in a white layer across the gravel of the farmyard and the packed dirt of the equipment shed lot. She walked through them to the gate of the 80-acre block. She stood at the gate. The canopy of the black amber sorghum was bent. Every stalk in the block was bent in the direction of the storm's track leaning east, at angles ranging from 20 to 40 degrees from vertical. The leaves were torn, not destroyed. Torn, the large, leathery blades showing the marks of the hail impact in patterns of bruising and small punctures that would be visible at close range, but that from the gate gave the block the appearance of a field that had survived something. The panicles at the top of every stalk were still attached, still enclosed in the boot, still protected by the tight sheath of the upper leaf that Vera had selected for her specifically in 1930 and 1931, because she had understood that the boot was where the grain lived, and the boot was what the hail tried hardest to destroy. The stalks were bent. They were not broken. Nora stood at the gate for a long time. The evening light was coming in flat from the west. Now the storm cell having moved east, and the sky behind it, clearing in the way the panhandle sky clears after a severe event rapidly and completely, as if it has finished what it came to do and has no further interest in the location. The light was golden on the bent and bruised canopy of the black amber block. She opened the gate and walked in. She walked the full length of the east fence row from south to north, moving slowly, touching the stalks as she passed them, feeling the stems between her fingers in the way her grandmother and mother had taught her to feel them. Not looking for obvious damage, but reading the material itself. The stiffness of the fiber, the integrity of the node structure, the way the stalk returned pressure. When she bent it slightly further and released it, the stems returned. They bent further and they came back. They did not snap. She counted broken stalks as she walked. She counted bent-over boots, the ones that had taken a direct impact and crumpled at the sheath junction. She counted torn leaves at a severity level that would affect photosynthesis. She kept the count in her head and transferred it to the notebook. That evening, the same way Vera had counted the morning after the 1929 storm. The same way Clara had counted after 1947. Her estimate, standing at the north end of the block at 5:15 in the evening of May 17, 1985, was that the block had lost approximately 8% of its yield potential to the storm. 8%. On a projected yield of 4,200 weight per acre. 8% was 336 weight per acre. A real loss. A loss she would feel in October. Not a loss that would end the season. She walked back to the house in the evening light. The next morning, she drove south on the county road toward the Braddock operation. She did not go to the Braddock gate. She went to the county road that ran along the east edge of the Braddock section, and she stopped the truck and got out and stood at the fence line and looked at what the storm had done to 1,200 acres of Pioneer 8444 hybrid grain sorghum that had been at the early boot stage the previous afternoon. The Pioneer 8444 was on the ground, not bent, not bruised. On the ground. The stalks, which had been bred for maximum grain yield, and which had the slender, efficient culm architecture that maximum grain yield selection produces, had snapped at the lower nodes under the impact of 1.75-inch hail at 340 stones per square yard per minute. The boot stage crop with its tender forming heads fully exposed because the hybrid sheath was thinner and shorter than the black amber sheath, had taken the impact directly on the developing panicle. 94% of the standing crop in the field in front of her was on the ground, or in a condition that would not produce a harvestable yield. She stood at the fence line for a while without moving, not with satisfaction, not with the feeling of having been proved right, with something that was more complicated than either of those things, something that had the texture of grief in it, alongside the confirmation. Because what was on the ground in front of her was a year's work by a family she had known her entire life. And because she understood better than most people what it felt like to stand at a fence line and reckon with a loss that you had not seen coming on the morning it arrived. Dale Braddock's operation was not the only one. She drove north on the county road and then west on the highway, and what she saw in every direction on the Dawson County dryland was the same. The hybrid grain sorghum was on the ground from one end of the storm track to the other. The National Weather Service track ran 50 miles wide from Bailey County through Dawson County through Lynn County, and the hybrid crop losses across that track, when the Texas A&M Extension Service compiled the damage assessment for the Federal Disaster Declaration, paperwork filed on May 20th were estimated at a total of $112 million across 4 counties. Nora drove home. She went to the 80-acre block and walked it again in the morning light, making the detailed count she would transfer to the breeding notebook. She counted every broken stalk. She counted every compromised boot. She measured the lean angle on 20 representative stalks with a handmade protractor she had built from a piece of cardboard and a nail and a length of thread weighted with a bolt. The same method Vera had described in the 1929 notebook entry. She wrote the numbers down. 8% yield loss estimate. Confirmed. Stem breakage rate 6.3% of stand. Boot integrity 91.4%. Of panicles intact within sheath. Leaf damage severity moderate. Expected recovery rate based on 1947 data. Full canopy function by 30 days post-storm. She closed the notebook. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. Gordon Tate drove the county roads that morning in his clean white pickup. He had driven them early before most people were in their fields, which was something he did after weather events because he believed that the county extension agent should have a preliminary assessment of storm damage before farmers came to him with questions. He had driven the Braddock section road and the other county roads in the storm track, and he had seen what the Pioneer 8444 and the DeKalb DK52 and the Northrop King in K265 looked like on the morning of May 18, 1985. He had turned onto the county road that ran past the Halsey home place on his way back to the extension office. He had slowed the truck when the Halsey 80-acre block came into view on the east side of the road. He had looked at it for a long time through the windshield. The black amber sorghum was bent. It was bruised. The leaves showed hail damage, and the stalks were vertical. Not all of them. Most of them. The block was standing in the morning light in the way that a field stands when the worst has come through it, and it has not gone down. He had pulled the truck off the road and stopped. He had sat in the cab with both hands on the wheel and looked at the standing black amber block across the fence line. He had been the Dawson County extension agent for 26 years. He had a spring bulletin in his filing cabinet in which he had 8 days earlier written that the 1985 season was shaping up to be among the strongest production years in recent memory. He had said publicly for 7 consecutive years that heritage open-pollinated sorghum was a sentimental gesture and not a production decision. He sat in the truck for 22 minutes. He did not get out. He did not go to the gate. He did not knock on the farmhouse door. He sat with his hands on the wheel and looked at the field that Vera Halsey had made the genetics for in 1928, and that Nora Halsey was growing on the same ground in 1985. And he looked at it until whatever he needed to finish thinking had finished. Then he drove back to the extension office. Cole Braddock, who was 26 years old in May of 1985, and who was in the process of taking over the day-to-day operations of the Braddock farm from his father, was driving the county road at approximately 9 that morning on his way to the co-op for repair parts. He saw Gordon Tate's white county pickup parked on the shoulder of the road in front of the Halsey property. He saw Gordon sitting in it. He drove past, slowly looked in his mirror, and saw that Gordon was still sitting there when Cole was a quarter mile down the road. Cole remembered this. He did not say anything about it to his father or to anyone at the La Mesa Cafe. He filed it in the category of things he had observed and not yet understood. By the end of the 3rd week of May 1985, every farmer in Dawson County knew about the Halsey block. Not from Nora. Nora had not told anyone. The story had moved the way stories move in agricultural counties, which is person to person at the co-op and the cafe and the elevator and the implement dealer. Each person who had driven past the Halsey property on the morning of May 18th, telling the next person what they had seen, which was a standing crop in the middle of a storm track that had put everything else on the ground. By the end of June, the Texas Panhandle Agricultural Press had picked it up. The Lubbock Avalanche Journal ran a piece on June 28th about heritage sorghum survival rates in the storm track. The piece did not name Nora. The piece referred to a single Dawson County operator who had maintained an open-pollinated heritage stand that had survived the May 17th event with less than 10% yield loss, while surrounding hybrid operations reported losses of 85 to 100%. The piece quoted Gordon Tate, who said that the results were agronomically interesting and warranted further study, and that he intended to review the County Extension Service's recommendations regarding variety diversification. He said it in the careful language of a man who is beginning to revise a public position and is doing it in the smallest increments the situation will allow. Dr. Frances Whitmore called Nora on July 3rd. She said she had seen the press coverage. She said she knew the Dawson County operator referred to in the reports was Nora. She said she wanted Nora's permission to publish a follow-up paper on the May 17th event and the storm survival data. Nora said she could use the data. She said, "Do not use my name." Dr. Whitmore said, "I know. I will refer to Cooperator H as before." She said there is something else. She said the storm survival results combined with the genetic characterization from the 1982 and 1984 papers had been seen by a researcher at the United States Department of Agriculture, Plant Genetics Resources Unit in Geneva, New York. The researcher had contacted her in June. He wanted to know if there was any possibility of establishing a formal conservation accession for the black amber line in the National Plant Germplasm System. He wanted to know if the cooperator would consent to providing a foundation seed sample for long-term conservation storage. Nora was quiet for a moment. She said who would have access to it. Dr. Whitmore said it would be conserved as a formally documented genetic resource. Access would be through standard USDA channels available to research programs, but not to commercial seed operations without consent from the original custodian. Nora said, "Let me think about it." She thought about it for 2 weeks. She thought about Vera leaving the Lubbock station with the only jar of foundation seed in existence because the A&M program had decided in 1937 that it did not need to keep it. She thought about what would happen to the line if the jar on the pantry shelf was broken, or if the farmhouse burned, or if she died without having transferred the seed to someone who would run the refreshment cycle. She thought about what her grandmother would have wanted, which was not for the line to be controlled or owned or turned into something commercial, but for it to survive. She called Dr. Whitmore back on July 17th and said yes. The 1985 harvest came in on the 15th of October. Nora ran the 402 with the combine header across the 80-acre block over 3 days, and the yield came in at 3,920 weight per acre, 280 weight below her 7-year average, 8% below projected, exactly as she had estimated. Standing at the north end of the block on the evening of May 17th, the grain test weight was 61 pounds per bushel. The protein was 12.5%. The line had not changed. The cash price at the Hereford Grain Cooperative on October 15, 1985, was the highest sorghum price the Texas Panhandle had recorded in 7 years. The hybrid losses across 4 counties had collapsed the regional grain supply. The elevators that had expected to handle a record volume were handling a fraction of projected tonnage, and the price had moved accordingly. Nora sold at $6.40 per hundredweight. Total revenue was $25,100 after fuel and seed and fertilizer, and the property tax allocation. The net was $15,600. It was less than her average year net. It was the only positive net that any sorghum operation in Dawson County recorded in the autumn of 1985. The phone had started ringing in early August, and it had not stopped. 47 farmers from 4 counties called the Halsey farmhouse between August 7th and September 4th. They called because they had lost their seed stock in the May event, and because they were looking at a 1986 replant on their entire operational acreage, and because the hybrid seed for 1986 would have to be bought new from Pioneer and DeKalb at retail prices that had climbed 38% on the regional shortage. Or they could buy heritage seed from the only standing source within 500 miles. Nora sat at the kitchen table on the evening of September 4th with the breeding notebook and a pencil, and wrote down what she could supply. 7,000 pounds of cleaned heritage seed in reserve from the 1985 harvest, and the accumulated working stock from the previous 2 years. 7,000 pounds was enough seed to plant approximately 5,800 acres at standard density. She decided she would sell to a maximum of 48 farms, at a maximum of 150 pounds per farm, on a first-come, first-served basis from the existing call list. Total potential revenue at 68 cents per pound across 48 maximum orders was $48,960. She also decided that every seed sale would include a one-time consultation visit from her to set up the planter and walk the seedling stand at 3 weeks. She typed the consultation protocol herself on Clara's 1932 Royal Quiet Deluxe portable typewriter. 14 pages, the same protocol Vera had documented in the breeding notebook translated into language that a farmer who had never grown heritage sorghum would understand without difficulty. Planting density, row spacing, planting depth, seed plate modification instructions with caliper measurements, moisture management at germination, the 5-year refreshment cycle, the selection criteria for maintaining line characteristics. The 14th page was a note in Nora's own handwriting. It said, "Do not crossbreed with hybrids. Do not buy seed from any commercial supplier to mix with this stock. Do not skip the refreshment cycle." The line was selected for the bad years. The bad years will come again. Keep the line until they do. The first seed shipment left the Halsey home place in the early morning of March 3, 1986, in burlap bags loaded into the bed of the C30 grain truck that Roy had bought in 1973, and that Nora had kept running with the same combination of routine maintenance and stubborn mechanical attention. She applied to everything on the operation. She was in the truck at 4:30 every morning. She arrived at every gate at first light. She walked every planter setup with the operator. She corrected the row spacing on 3 operations where the planter had been set for hybrid density. She corrected the planting depth on 4 operations where the farmer had been planting too deep out of hybrid habit. She refused to charge for the corrections. She drove home at dusk and slept in her own bed and started again at 4:30 the next morning. By the middle of April, she had visited 29 of the 46 farms that had signed seed contracts. She had driven 680 miles in 6 weeks. She had not sent an invoice for any of the consultation visits that had run over the contracted 1 visit per farm, because she had decided that if she was going to teach people to grow the line correctly, she was going to teach them correctly and worry about the accounting later. On the morning of April 22nd, she came back from a consultation visit at a 140-acre operation in Garza County, 2 counties east, and found a note tucked into the doorframe of the farmhouse. The note was on a piece of paper torn from a spiral notebook, and it said, "Came by to talk. Will come back." It was signed C. Braddock. She looked at the note for a moment. She knew which Braddock it was. Dale was 65 years old in the spring of 1986 and was not the kind of man who left notes. Cole was 27 and was the kind of man who did things his father had not yet decided to do. She put the note on the kitchen table and went to make coffee and thought about what it meant that a Braddock had come to her gate and not found her home. Cole Braddock came back on the morning of April 24, 1986. Nora heard the truck on the county road before she saw it. The particular sound of a well-maintained Ford F-15, slowing at the gate, the crunch of gravel as it pulled off the road and stopped. She was at the equipment shed doing the morning check on the 402 before she drove out to the Lubbock County consultation visit she had scheduled for that day. And she straightened up from the engine compartment and wiped her hands on the shop rag and walked to the shed door. Cole Braddock was 27 years old in the spring of 1986. He had his father's height and his father's weathered look, but not yet his father's settled certainty about things, which was the look of a man who had spent 40 years making up his mind and no longer found it necessary to revisit the conclusions. Cole still had the look of a man who was paying attention, which is a different thing and which is more useful in most of the situations that matter. He was standing at the gate with his hat in his hands. She walked over. She unlatched the gate but did not open it fully. She said, "Cole, you want coffee?" He said, "No, thank you." He said, "I came to ask if you would sell the Braddock Operation heritage seed for the 1986 replant." She said, "How much ground?" He said, "We have lost 94% of the standing crop across the full 1,200 acres. We are looking at a complete replant. We need to decide in the next 2 weeks because the planting window closes in May. And if we miss it, we are looking at sorghum Sudan cover crop for the summer. And no grain harvest until 1987. He paused. He said, "The Pioneer seed bill for 1,200 acres at the new retail price is $31,000. We cannot float that number right now." She said the heritage seed is 68 cents a pound. You need 150 pounds per 100 acres at standard density. For 1,200 acres, that is 1,800 pounds at $1,224 total. He looked at her. He said that is considerably less than $31,000. She said, "Yes, it is." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 80-acre block behind her, the black amber stand. At the 4-week stage, the seedlings emerged in their straight north-south rows with the particular vigor she had been documenting in the breeding notebook since 1978. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Nora, my father has driven past your field every October for 8 years. He slows down at the east fence line and he counts the yield from the truck window. He has never stopped, and he has never said anything about it to me or to anyone that I know of. But I have been in the truck with him twice when he did it, and I know what it looks like when my father is counting a yield he respects." Nora looked at him. He said, "I think he knew by 1980 that you were right about the line. I think he has known for 6 years and has not found a way to say it. I am not here on his behalf. He does not know I am here. But I wanted you to know that." He said it the way a young man says a true thing, that he has been carrying for a while and has decided to put down simply and without theater, because the truth does not require theater. Nora was quiet for a moment. She opened the gate the rest of the way. She said, "Come to the shed and we will work out the seed order." They spent 40 minutes at the workbench in the equipment shed, going through the planting protocol. Nora pulled the type consultation document and went through it page by page. She showed Cole the seed plate modification on the 4-row planter, running her finger along the caliper measurements, explaining why the black amber kernel was larger than hybrid, and why the modification mattered for achieving the correct density without cracking the grain. She showed him the row spacing recommendation, and the planting depth and the germination moisture management notes that Vera had first written in 1934, and that Nora had updated with her own observations from 1978 through 1985. Cole took notes. He asked careful questions. When he did not understand something, he said so, and she explained it again from a different angle. He had his father's practical intelligence and his mother, Imogene's, willingness to admit what he did not know. Which was the more valuable of the two in a learning situation? At the end of 40 minutes, he had a complete understanding of the planting protocol and a seed order for 1,800 pounds at $1,224 to be delivered from the Halsey seed bins in the first week of May. He said, "Nora, the consultation visit that comes with the seed order." She said, "1 visit planner setup and 3 weeks seedling walk." He said, "Would you be willing to do 2 visits?" He said, "My father is going to want to walk the stand himself, and I would like him to hear the protocol from you directly." She said, "1 visit at the contracted rate and 1 additional visit at $60 an hour." Cole said, "That is fair." He shook her hand at the gate. He drove back down the county road. Nora went back to the equipment shed and looked at the 402 for a moment, and then went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and thought about Dale Braddock slowing his truck at the east fence line every October for 8 years and counting her yield from the window without stopping. She thought about what that cost a man like Dale, the kind of man who had been publicly and repeatedly wrong about something he had been publicly and repeatedly confident about, to drive past the evidence of his error every year for 8 years and carry it alone. She understood it. Not easily, but she understood it. The seed shipment went to the Braddock operation in the first week of May as agreed. Cole ran the planter himself on the first day, and Nora came out for the setup walk and found the plates had been modified correctly from the instructions, and the row spacing was set right, and the planting depth was where she had specified. She walked 3 rows with Cole and checked the seed drop and said it was correct and drove home. The 3-week seedling walk on the Braddock operation was on a Wednesday morning in late May. She drove over at first light. Cole met her at the gate. They walked the stand together for 2 hours, moving through the rows in the early morning light. Nora crouching at intervals to measure seedling vigor, with the small ruler she carried in her jacket pocket, calling out observations that Cole wrote in a field notebook. The stand was uniform. The emergence was clean. The stem caliper at 3 weeks was coming in at the standard black amber specification 22 to 24%, above hybrid reference at the same stage. Nora wrote the measurements in her own notebook, and Cole wrote them in his. Dale Braddock came out at 9 o'clock. He walked down from the equipment shed with his hat on and his hands in his jacket pockets, and he stopped at the edge of the rows where Nora and Cole were standing. He looked at the seedling stand. He looked at the uniformity of emergence across the field row, after straight row of black amber seedlings in the morning light. He looked at it for a while without speaking. Then he looked at Nora. He said, "It looks like a good stand." She said, "It is a good stand." She said, "The emergence is uniform, and the vigor is above reference spec." She said, "If you manage the moisture at the 30-day mark, the way the protocol specifies, and run the nitrogen at the heritage rate rather than the hybrid rate, you will come in between 4,200 and 4,500 weight at the hybrid price the regional shortage has established." She said, "You will net more per acre on this stand than you have netted on hybrid in any year I can document." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He said, "I have been running the per acre net comparison in my head since 1980. He said, "The input cost differential and the price premium on test weight and protein make the heritage net competitive with hybrid net even in a normal year." He said, "In a bad year, the heritage net is the only net available." He said, "I knew this before last May." Nora said nothing. He said, "I have owed you that acknowledgement for 6 years. And I did not give it to you, because I had said publicly that you were wrong. And I did not want to admit publicly that I had been wrong." He said, "That is a small reason for a long silence, and I am not proud of it." He looked at the stand again. He said, "Vera Halsey was your grandmother, and she bred this line on this ground, and she knew exactly what she was doing." He said, "Clara Halsey was your mother, and she kept it for 40 years, and she knew exactly what she was doing." He said you are your grandmother's granddaughter and your mother's daughter. And you knew exactly what you were doing in March of 1978 when you planted it. He said I told you in April of 1978 that I could not help you, and I could not stop you, and I would watch what happened. He said I have watched what happened. He said I was wrong and you were right, and I am sorry it took me this long to say it to your face. He said it the way Dale Braddock said the few things he said that mattered, which was straight and short and without decoration, because he was a man who had spent his life among people who could tell the difference between a thing said to be said and a thing said to be true. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said, Dale, you were forgiven the night Imogene sent you over to my gate in April of 1978. She said you did not need to come today. He said I did need to come today. He said I needed to come today for my own reasons, not for yours. She nodded once. Cole was standing a few feet away looking at his field notebook. She said, the 30-day moisture management note is on page 8 of the protocol document. She said, come find me if anything in the stand looks unusual between now and the July assessment. She drove home. By the end of May 1986, 46 of the 48 contracted farms had planted their black amber seed. Nora had visited every one of them for the planter setup walk and had driven 840 miles in 3 weeks. 2 farms had needed unscheduled additional visits for planter calibration issues that had not been caught at the initial setup. And she had made those visits without charging the extra rate because the error had been hers in the original assessment. She did not discuss this decision with anyone. It was simply what the situation required. The 1986 growing season was a good moisture year across the South Plains. The black amber stands on the 46 contract farms came through the spring and into the summer. In the condition the line was bred to perform in, which was steady and consistent, and not requiring the level of input management the hybrid varieties demanded. No catastrophic weather events crossed the South Plains in the summer of 1986. The season that followed May 17, 1985, was an ordinary season. And in ordinary seasons, the heritage line did what Vera had designed it to do in ordinary seasons, which was grow at a yield rate below the hybrid ceiling, but at a net rate per acre that compared favorably after inputs. Gordon Tate drove the county roads that summer in his clean white pickup. He had served as Dawson County Extension Agent for 27 years by the summer of 1986, and he was 69 years old. And he had been thinking since the morning of May 18th, 1985, about what he had seen when he stopped at the fence line in front of the Halsey property and sat in the truck for 22 minutes and looked at the standing black amber in the middle of the storm track. He had been thinking about what he had written in the spring bulletin of May 9th, 1985, 8 days before the storm. He had been thinking about what he had said at the November 1978 sorghum producers meeting and the February 1982 newsletter, and the many mornings at the La Mesa Cafe, and the conversation with Gerald Pruitt at the First National Bank. He had been thinking about the particular quality of 19 consecutive years of public correctness and what it cost to revise a public position that had been stated 19 years in a row. He drove past the Halsey home place on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of June. He slowed the truck at the gate. He looked at the black amber stand in its straight north-south rows, the canopy closed across the full 80 acres, in the thick, even way that a well-managed heritage stand closes, when the moisture is right and the population is correct. He pulled over. He got out. He walked to the gate and knocked on the post. Nora was in the equipment shed and heard it and came out. She saw Gordon Tate standing at her gate in his A&M field polo, with his county pickup parked on the shoulder. and his leather portfolio under his arm. She walked over. She said, "Gordon." He said, "Nora, I would like to ask if I may walk the block." She looked at him for a moment. She unlatched the gate and held it open. He walked in. He walked the east fence row from south to north, and then crossed to the west fence row and walked back. He moved at the pace of a man who has spent 27 years walking fields and knows what he is looking at and is taking his time to look at it correctly. He crouched twice to measure a stalk with a small ruler he took from his portfolio. He stood at the north end of the block and looked south across the full length of the stand. He came back to where Nora was standing at the gate. He said the canopy closure is complete at 11 weeks. He said the stem caliper on the samples I measured is consistent with what Dr. Whitmore published in the 1984 paper. He said the stand is exactly what the literature describes. She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been doing this work for 27 years. And I stated publicly for 8 of those years that what you were doing here was a sentimental gesture and not a production decision." He said, "I stated it as professional consensus because the Extension Service yield data and the A&M recommendations supported the statement." He said, "I did not look at the cost side of the ledger carefully enough, and I did not weight the catastrophic weather risk correctly." He said, "I also did not read your grandmother's work, and I should have." He said, "I knew it existed because you described it at the bank in 1978 when Gerald Pruitt told me about your conversation." He said, "I decided it was historical rather than operational, and I moved on." He said that was a failure of professional judgment. He said, "I would like to correct the public record." Nora said, "What do you mean?" He said the July issue of the Dawson County Sorghum Producers Association newsletter goes out in 10 days. He said he wanted to write a piece for it. He said he wanted to describe the black amber line, its origins, its agronomic characteristics, the May 17th storm survival data, and the performance of the 1986 contract plantings across the county. He said he wanted to name the Halsey operation directly and describe the 3 generations of women who had maintained the line since 1928. He said he wanted to say in the newsletter in print that his previous statements regarding the heritage planting had been incorrect, and that the Halsey operation represented the most significant agricultural achievement in Dawson County in his 27 years as extension agent. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Gordon, why do you want to do this?" He said, "Because it is accurate." He said, "Because the record should be accurate." He said, "Because the farmers in this county made planting decisions for 8 years, based in part on his public statements about the heritage line. And some of those decisions cost them money. And one of those decisions, the decision not to maintain any heritage diversity in their variety selection, cost 4 counties $112 million in May of 1985. He said, "Because a woman spent 8 years being publicly dismissed on his professional authority, and the professional authority was wrong, and the record should say so." Nora was quiet for a while. She looked at the black amber stand behind him, the 11-week canopy in the June morning light, the stalks already showing the thickness at the lower nodes that Vera had first selected for in 1929. She said yes. She said use her name, and use Vera's name, and use Clara's name. She said, get the breeding history right. She said she would give him the notebook to review for accuracy before he submitted the piece. He said, "Thank you." He said he would come by on Thursday to go through the notebook. He came on Thursday with his leather portfolio and a fresh yellow legal pad and sat at Nora's kitchen table for 3 hours while she went through the breeding history from Vera's first 1928 entry to the most recent observation pages. He took notes. He asked careful questions. He wrote down dates and measurements and selection criteria with the same methodical thoroughness he had brought to 27 years of county extension work, which was the same quality that had made him publicly wrong for 8 years, because it was a thoroughness applied too narrowly to the yield data and not to the risk data, to the hybrid performance tables, and not to the heritage notebook sitting in a farmhouse outside La Mesa. He left at noon. He thanked her for the coffee and for the notebook access, and he drove back to the extension office and wrote the piece. The July issue of the Dawson County Sorghum Producers Association newsletter ran Gordon Tate's piece on the front page. It was 11 column inches, and it named Vera Halsey and Clara Halsey and Nora Halsey, and described the breeding program from 1928 through 1934, and the refreshment cycles from 1934 through 1985, and the May 17th storm. Survival data in specific numbers 8%. Yield loss on the Halsey block. 94% loss on the surrounding hybrid operations. Total 4-county losses of $112 million against the Halsey operations' positive net. It described the 46 contract plantings in 1986 and the stand quality reports from the planters' setup visits. It said in Gordon Tate's careful Extension Service prose that the County Extension Service's previous recommendations regarding heritage variety selection had underweighted catastrophic weather risk, and that the Halsey Black Amber line represented an agronomic resource of material significance to dryland sorghum production in the Texas South Plains. It said that the professional assessment of the County Extension Service had been incorrect, and that Nora Halsey's production decision in March of 1978 had been correct. Gordon Tate retired from the Dawson County Extension Agent position in September of 1986. He wrote Nora a letter on county letterhead on his last day in the office. The letter was one paragraph. It said that in 27 years of county extension work, the most important agricultural research he had encountered had not come from a university program or a seed company trial or an A&M bulletin. It had come from a leather notebook written by a woman at a Lubbock experiment station between 1928 and 1937, and kept by her daughter and her granddaughter on an 80-acre block outside La Mesa for the following 50 years. He said he wished he had read it sooner. He said he was glad someone had kept it. Nora put the letter in the back cover of the breeding notebook behind Dr. Whitmore's correspondence and the Texas A&M de-accession letter from 1978. She did not show it to anyone. It was not for showing. It was for keeping the way the line itself was, for keeping the way the notebook was, for keeping the way the glass jar on the pantry shelf had been kept since 1937. Because keeping things correctly is its own form of argument. Dr. Frances Whitmore published her 4th paper on the Black Amber line in the autumn of 1986. This one in Plant Breeding Reviews, a comprehensive genetic characterization that established the line's formal taxonomic description and confirmed its status as the sole surviving field expression of pre-hybrid Texas dryland sorghum genetics in the national collection. The paper named Vera Halsey and Clara Halsey and Nora Halsey. Nora had given permission when Dr. Whitmore asked in July. The paper was read by every sorghum geneticist at every land-grant university in the country. It was read by the USDA Plant Genetics Resources Unit in Geneva, New York, where the formal conservation accession for the Black Amber line had been established following Nora's agreement the previous year. It was read by 4 seed company research directors who each contacted Nora's mailing address through Dr. Whitmore's office and each received the same written reply, a single page on plain paper, in Nora's pencil handwriting, stating that the black amber line was not available for commercial licensing and that any research use would be subject to the terms of the USDA accession agreement. The La Mesa Cafe ran a story in the La Mesa Press Reporter in October 1986 about the heritage line. It was on the front page. Asa Goodnight was quoted. He was 78 years old, and he said, "I set Cleon Halsey's first windmill in 1948. And I knew Vera Halsey, and I knew Clara Halsey, and I will say this once, and clearly the granddaughter is what the grandmother was, and the grandmother was the finest practical plant breeder this county has ever produced." He said he was sorry he had not said so in 1978. He said he should have known better because he had bought seed from Vera Halsey himself in 1955. And it had been the best seed he had run on his own ground, and he had known it at the time. Cole Braddock came to the Halsey gate on a Saturday morning in October after the harvest. He had harvested the full 1,200 acres of black amber on the Braddock operation, and the yield had averaged 4,400 weight per acre on the dryland sections and 4,800 on the irrigation running at the input cost the heritage line required, which was substantially below the hybrid input structure. The net had come in comparable to a strong hybrid year in dollar terms. He knocked on the gate post at 7 in the morning. Nora came out. He said, "Nora, I want to learn what my grandfather should have learned in 1978. She looked at him. She said, "Come back next Saturday at 7 and bring a notebook." He came back the next Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. By the end of October, he had come back 4 Saturdays in a row, and they had covered the refreshment cycle methodology, the selection criteria for stem caliper and boot integrity and grain fill timing, the seed storage protocol, and the first 40 pages of the breeding notebook. He took notes in the spiral notebook he had brought to the gate the first morning, and he asked careful questions. And when he did not understand something, he came back to it until he did. He did not pay her for the Saturday visits. She did not ask him to. On the 5th Saturday, Dale came with him. Dale Braddock was 66 years old that October. He wore his tall-crowned Wrangler hat and his Carhartt canvas jacket, and he stood at the gate while Cole knocked, and he took his hat off when Nora came to the door, which was the gesture of a man who understands that he is on ground that has earned a particular kind of respect. Nora held the gate open. She said, "Both of you come in." They walked the stubble of the 80-acre block together, all three of them, in the October morning light. The harvest was in. The stubble was cut short, and the ground showed the red-brown of the Dawson County clay in the late fall sun. Nora walked them through the post-harvest assessment methodology, the row count she used to calculate effective population density, the stubble measurement she used to gauge stem integrity across the season, the soil temperature record she kept from planting through harvest to document the line's thermal response at each growth stage. Dale listened without speaking for most of the walk. He picked up a piece of stubble and ran his thumb along the cut end and held it the way a man holds a piece of material he is learning to read. He said, "These nodes are solid all the way down." She said yes. She said the stem architecture is what Vera selected for in 1929 and 1932. She said, "The Mediterranean dryland genetics give you the node density, and the African genetics give you the fiber quality, and the 6 consecutive seasons of selection on this specific clay soil lock the combination into the line." She said you can pull any stalk from any row in any year I have harvested, and the nodes will read the same way. He held the stubble for another moment. Then he said Vera Halsey knew this ground better than any agronomist who ever drove a county road in a clean pickup. Nora said yes. He set the stubble down. He walked the rest of the block without speaking. At the north end, he turned and looked south across the cut field. The October light was long and flat on the stubble, and the red clay showed between the rows in the particular color. It got in late fall when the moisture was down and the harvest dust had settled. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at the field for a long time. He said Roy would have liked to see this. Nora was quiet for a moment. She said yes. She said Roy would have wanted to walk every row of it. Dale said I know. He said Roy trusted you and I did not honor that trust the way I should have. He said I am sorry. She said, Dale, you are forgiven. She said you have been forgiven since 1978. She said what you can do now is learn the lines so that when the next bad year comes, the Braddock operation knows how to stand through it. He said that is what I am here to do. The Saturday visits became a fixture of the Halsey and Braddock operations through the winter of 1986 and into the spring of 1987. Cole came every week. Dale came most weeks. They went through the breeding notebook from the first page to the last, all of it. Vera's original entries and Clara's continuation and Nora's additions, and the current year's observation pages. Cole built his own version of the observation system in his spiral notebook, adapted to the Braddock operations' acreage scale and field layout, with the same column structure Vera had used in 1928, and the same measurement protocols, and the same seasonal timing. In November of 1986, after the harvest data was in and the seed reserves had been inventoried, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the breeding notebook and turned to the last entry in Vera's original section. The December 1936 pages she had read 100 times since Clara's death in 1976. She read the final paragraph of Vera's writing, the part about the hybrid path and the good years and the bad years and the need for someone to keep the line. Then she turned to the final page of Vera's section, the last page before Clara's section began, and she read the 3 lines at the bottom that she had also read 100 times. Vera had written, "The program has made its choice. I am making mine. The seed goes home with me tonight." Below those 3 lines in the narrow margin at the very bottom of the page, there was a line that Nora had not noticed in all the time she had read those pages. She had not noticed it because it was written in a lighter pencil than the rest of the entry, and in a smaller hand, and it was right at the edge of the page where the margin met the binding. She held the notebook closer to the kitchen light. The line said, "When the jar is empty, fill it with what the line has made. The jar is for the next someone after you." Nora sat at the table for a long time. The jar was on the pantry shelf behind her, the half-gallon mason jar with the zinc lid, and the yellowed paraffin and the faded label, the jar that Vera had carried from the Lubbock station in February of 1937. The foundation seed that had been in it in 1937 had been planted and refreshed and harvested and distributed and conserved in the National Gene Bank and planted on 1,200 Braddock acres and on 46 other farms in 4 Texas counties, and was growing in the fields and in the breeding records and in the carefully written pages of Cole Braddock's spiral notebook. The jar was not empty. It still held the current foundation reserve, the selected seed from the 2,985 harvest that she had cleaned and weighed and stored. But Vera's line was in the sentence she had written in the margin in December of 1936, which was that the jar was not the thing. The seed was the thing. The jar was for holding it until the next someone was ready. She looked at the notebook in her hands, the leather cover worn soft at the corners. The pages filled from 1928 to 1986 in 3 different hands. She went to the kitchen drawer and took out a new composition notebook. The black and white marbled kind, the same kind she had been using for her own observations since 1978. She set it on the table next to the leather notebook. She opened the first page of the new notebook and wrote at the top in pencil, "For Cole Braddock. Started November 1986. Continued from the work of Vera Halsey and Clara Halsey and Nora Halsey." Then she wrote the first entry, the same way Vera had written the first entry in March of 1928, with the date and the weather observation and the soil temperature and the seedling emergence count and the stem caliper measurement at the 30-day mark, all the numbers in the correct columns, all the observations in the correct order. She filled the first 6 pages that evening. The following Saturday, she handed the new notebook to Cole at the gate. She said, "This is yours." She said, "Keep it the way the leather one was kept." She said, "Add to it every season and teach the next person in the same way." Cole took the notebook with both hands. He looked at the first page. He read the header she had written. He looked at her. She said the line belongs to whoever will keep it correctly. She said it has belonged to 3 women in this family for 58 years. Because those 3 women were the ones who would keep it correctly. She said now it belongs to you also. Because you came to the gate on a Saturday morning in October and asked to learn it. He said, "I will keep it." She said, "I know you will." He came back the next Saturday. He came back through the winter and through the planting season of 1987, and through the summer and through the harvest, carrying the new notebook at every visit, and adding his entries in his own hand in the same columns Vera had established in 1928. By the end of 1987, the new notebook had 28 pages filled in Cole Braddock's careful block handwriting. The Braddock operation's 1,200 acres of black amber, documented in the same system that had documented the Halsey 80-acre block since the first year Vera planted it on the Lubbock Station selection plot. The USDA Plant Genetics Resources Unit established the formal black amber conservation accession in Geneva, New York, in the spring of 1988. The accession document listed the originating custodian as Vera Halsey, Lubbock, Texas, 1934, and the chain of custody as Clara Halsey, 1937, to 1976, and Nora Halsey, 1976 to present. The accession was the first formally documented heritage dryland sorghum line in the national system to carry an unbroken private custodianship record of more than 50 consecutive years. Dr. Whitmore sent Nora a copy of the accession document with a handwritten note that said the program had reviewed 340 heritage grain lines for formal accession in 1987 and 1988, and that the black amber documentation record the continuous breeding notebook from 1928 to present with unbroken selection. Cycle documentation across 3 generational custodians was the most complete private custodian seed conservation record in the system. She said that Vera Halsey's 1928 to 1934 selection work had been formally entered into the historical record of the United States National Plant Genetic Resources Program. She said that the La Mesa operation had saved something the institutional program had thrown away in 1953 and had kept it alive for 35 more years in a glass jar on a pantry shelf and in 5-acre refreshment plots and in 800 miles of consultation visits in a C-30 grain truck and in a column of pencil entries in a leather notebook, and that without those things the genetics would not exist anywhere. She said she had been a plant breeding researcher for 22 years, and that the most important conservation work she had encountered in those 22 years had been done by a woman in Dawson County, Texas, who read her grandmother's notebook and decided to do what the notebook said. Nora put the letter with the others in the back cover of the leather notebook. She went to the pantry and looked at the jar on the second shelf. The half-gallon mason jar with the zinc lid, and the yellowed paraffin, and the faded label in Vera's grease pencil hand. She had not moved it from that shelf since she brought it down to the kitchen table in January of 1978 to look at it while she read Clara's letter. 44 years on the shelf had become 10 more years of standing, 1 more decade of being the thing it was. She took it down. She carried it to the kitchen table and set it in the light from the window. She looked at the label, at Vera's faded block letters at the paraffin ring that had held since 1937 and was still holding. She thought about Vera at 38 years old, walking out of the Lubbock station in February of 1937, with a cardboard box and a signed-off parting handshake from Dr. Edna Renfro and a jar of foundation seed that the program had decided it did not need. She thought about what it had cost Vera to leave that station, the 9 years of work she was walking away from the line she had made. That the institution had chosen not to keep the decision, to carry it herself anyway, because the alternative was to leave it behind and watch it disappear. She thought about Clara at the kitchen table in 1971, writing the letter to Nora and putting it in the dresser drawer to wait 5 years for its moment. She thought about what Clara had known in 1971 that made her write Nora, "You are the next someone." She thought about what it meant to know your daughter well enough, to know that she was the right person, and to trust her with something that could not be replaced if she was wrong. She thought about Roy. She thought about what Roy would have said on the morning of May 18th, 1985. Standing at the gate of the 80-acre block, looking at the bent but standing black amber in the middle of the storm track. She thought he would not have said much. She thought he would have looked at the field for a long time, and then looked at her and nodded once the way men nod when they understand that something has been confirmed that they already believed but could not prove. She thought about Gordon Tate sitting in his clean white pickup for 22 minutes at the fence line on the morning of May 18th, 1985, and what it had cost him to sit there and look at the standing field and understand what he was looking at. She thought about Dale Braddock picking up a piece of stubble and running his thumb along the cut end and saying, "These nodes are solid all the way down." She thought about Cole Braddock at the gate in April of 1986, with his hat in his hands, saying, "I think he knew by 1980 that you were right about the line." She set the jar back on the pantry shelf. She went to the kitchen table and opened the leather notebook to the current observation pages and picked up her pencil and wrote the date and the weather observation and the morning temperature at the soil surface, and began the day's entry, the way she had begun every day's entry since 1978, in the same columns, in the same order, adding 1 more line to the record that Vera had started in March of 1928, on a selection plot outside Lubbock, on a morning that nobody else had thought was particularly significant. Vera Halsey had spent 9 years making something that the institution decided it did not need. She had carried it home in a jar and trusted it to her daughter, and her daughter had trusted it to her daughter. And on the morning of May 18th, 1985, it had been the only standing sorghum crop in 4 Texas counties. The men at the La Mesa Cafe had laughed for an hour and 40 minutes in April of 1978 when they heard about the heritage planting. They were not laughing on the morning of May 18th, 1985. They were driving the county roads and looking at their fields on the ground, and some of them were thinking in the way that people think when the evidence has finally arrived in a form they cannot argue with about a woman who had planted 420 pounds of her grandmother's seed on a red clay flat west of La Mesa 7 years before, and had said in a quiet voice at a gate in April that the bad year would come in a season nobody was predicting. Nobody had predicted May 17th, 1985. Vera Halsey had. She had written it in a breeding notebook in December of 1936 and trusted it to Clara, and Clara had trusted it to Nora, and Nora had trusted it to the ground, and the ground had held it. The way good ground holds what is planted in it correctly, which is without drama, without announcement, without any particular interest in whether anyone is watching. It holds it until the season comes when it matters, and then it shows you what it kept.